It's my pleasure to be talking to the one and only Mr. Navneet Munot. He needs no introduction. He's got a tremendously long and rich experience in the world of investing. Welcome, sir. It's a privilege to be talking to you for this particular magazine, V Horizon, the video edition of Horizon.
Amit, what a pleasure to be part of the first edition of Horizon. I wish the entire family of JM and all the viewers the very best.
So let's start with looking at the world at this juncture. As you know and as you see, the developed world especially is facing a war, probably after a pretty long time. There is high inflation, food scarcity, and energy crisis all rolled into one. Many large countries also have huge debt burden in comparison to the size of the GDP. On the other hand, some developing and frontier countries are facing hyperinflation, and the economic conditions in these countries are also poor. In such a situation, do you see the possibilities of economies of some of these countries failing? What could be the implications for the world if we look at these events?
Thank you, Amit. I think you have put it very rightly that there are a lot of uncertainties in the world. In fact, it may sound like a cliche to say that we live in a VUCA world, but we actually live in a VUCA world. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And look at the events in the last 2 or 3 years. I think we don't have to go back in history, but the way 2020 panned out, I think at the beginning of the year, things were looking pretty rosy, pretty okay. And then we had one of the biggest health crises, economic crisis, even to some extent a social crisis because of the pandemic. Inequality increased. We have witnessed geopolitical crisis, whether you look at US-China, India-China, US-Iran, and now such a big war in the heart of Europe, that's Russia-Ukraine. So geopolitical crisis, and of course a climate crisis. We have never seen inflation in the developed world the way we have seen over the last couple of quarters. This is at a 40-year high. Variety of reasons. I think the amount of money that has got printed, particularly since 2008 global financial crisis, and the fiscal stimulus that has been unleashed more so after the pandemic, together they did not create a goods and services inflation so far because globalization helped, because most of this money actually led to an asset price inflation, but not a widespread goods and services price inflation. Now we are seeing this easy liquidity plus maybe to some extent a lot of supply disruptions and some of the other reasons leading to higher inflation, which has led to interest rate hikes that we haven't seen in the last 40 years in the developed world. In India, we have been used to bouts of inflation. We have seen several times in our history, but the Western world or the developed world has never seen a 7, 8, 9 or 10% inflation. So this is a difficult time for them. People have been worried about fiscal policy in UK. They have been worried about monetary policy in Japan. They have been worried about energy and defense policy in Europe. They have been worried about politics in China and various things in US. Amidst all of this, of course, India looks good, but you are absolutely right. We live in a highly uncertain environment as far as the world is concerned. This year again, I think things were looking okay till some time back, and then last week we had this big challenge coming in from a Silicon Valley bank not able to meet their depositors' requests. So I think again we don't know how things will pan out. But I must add one thing: the optimist in me also says that I've always said that earlier, that reforms never happen out of conviction. They always happen out of compulsion. And maybe the compulsion, whether what the Europe is going through, what US is going through, what some of the other countries are going through, may lead to structural reforms which otherwise wouldn't have happened. In fact, I think there is a possibility that as world invests in new infrastructure to create growth, as world shifts focus from just keep supplying easy liquidity and prop up asset prices to create a more lasting, sustainable growth, which can create jobs, which can provide more sustainability to the planet, so on and so forth, could turn out to be good. Who knows? Maybe so. I think the optimist in me keeps saying that maybe all of these challenges will ultimately lead to reforms which could turn out to be good for the humanity and good for the world. But yeah, in the interim, we have to go through this uncertain time.
Brilliant answer, sir. As you rightly mentioned, we live in a VUCA world, however cliched it may sound. But from that troubled world, now let's come home and look at India's position. India recently got the presidency of G20. India is also being seen as a global power that the world cannot ignore. What has been some of the successes and what are the reasons, according to you, behind those successes?
I think the G20 presidency has come at the right time. Looking at the challenges the world is facing, which we just discussed a few minutes back, the kind of challenges world has, the geopolitical crisis, the economic crisis, deglobalization, decarbonization that the world has to embark upon. I think we have borrowed a lot from the future generations. I think we need to repay that to our planet. The world is also digitally redesigning, and India has a very big role to play as one of the most data-rich country. The world is, at least the large part of the developed world, and even now China has started degrowing in terms of population. So on the demographic side, India would be one of the largest supplier of labor force as well as the largest supplier of emerging consumers to the world. So I think looking at all of this, and as I mentioned, particularly about the geopolitical challenges that the world is facing, the rising influence of China in this part of the Pacific, I think the world needs a counterbalance, and India clearly, with its democracy, with its demographics, with its digitalization, with the demand that we have, and of course I've been saying the fifth D, the determination of 1.4 billion people, that this time is ours and we need to make the most of it. I think it's an opportune time for us to lead the G20. As I mentioned that historically, when we look at the journey of several countries which have gone from emerging countries to emerged, from emerged to a developed country, they wouldn't have cared much about rest of the world, rest of the humanity, rest of the planet. But India's growth model is so different. I think our growth model is a lot more sustainable, lot more inclusive, lot more democratic, and lot more equitable. And that's why, as I said, that the world needs to look up to India for its economic growth model, for its multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual society which has been living so peacefully for centuries. There's a lot that the world can learn from India, and I'm sure the leadership of India to G20 will do good to the humanity in the long run.
Thank you, Navneet sir. You rightly pointed it out. India's emergence as a power. World cannot afford to ignore India. Thank you for this elaborate answer. So let's look at the changing world order. In last few years, there have been many talks about China plus one and recently Europe plus one. Especially in the post-COVID world, these two have sort of become regular conversations among markets, among experts, among the economic circles. How real are these ideas?
Amit, you are absolutely right. There are tremendous opportunities for India from China plus one as well as the Europe plus one. We keep hearing this word deglobalization for last few years. What I call It's not deglobalization. This is actually a globalization of localization. As increasingly organizations, countries will focus a lot more on producing locally. We are moving from a world of hyper-optimized supply chain to a more reliable supply chain. And that's where I think India has a lot of opportunities. The countries that want to diversify their supply chain for manufactured goods from, let's say, countries like China, they can look at India. And also, particularly on the food side, Russia, Ukraine together have been a large food supplier to not only to Europe, but a lot of other countries. There could be opportunity for India on that front as well. So with our policies and people, when I talk about the policies, all the structural reforms that have happened, plus the infrastructure that we are putting in to bring down the logistics cost, to bring down the power cost over a period of time as we skill our labor, and over the next several years, India would be one of the largest supplier of labor force to the world given our demographics dividend. I think India is rightly, and the policies like PLI, particularly, which has really helped in areas like electronics, chemicals, and many more sectors are likely to benefit over a period of time. Tax rates have been brought down for the corporate sector. So I think the stars are just getting aligned for India to take advantage of the opportunities that are coming our way. I always say, in a world which is geopolitically realigning, a world which is demographically diverging, a world which is digitally redesigning, decarbonizing, and deleveraging. And amidst all of that, I think India really looks like an oasis of hope, and I'm sure the world will look at India more and more as a reliable partner to source various things. So we could be a reliable and trustworthy factory of the world, a reliable and trustworthy farm of the world, and a reliable and trustworthy front office of the world over the next several decades. We will be competing hard with a lot of other economies. So if the world is looking at an opportunity from China plus one plus Europe plus one, we are not the only one in the play. There are a lot of other countries who will also eye this opportunity. We have to earn our space in that, but I'm pretty sure policymakers are moving in the right directions, and Indian entrepreneurs won't leave any stone unturned to make the most of this opportunity over the next several decades.
A movement from hyper-optimized supply chain to a highly reliable supply chain. What a thought, sir. Thank you so much for this brilliant idea. Also for highlighting the opportunities that India has to become the factory of the world, the farm of the world, and the front office of the world. Brilliant, brilliant as usual. Thank you so much for this. And that brings me to the next point. On the occasion of 75th Independence Day of our country, our Prime Minister talked about the Amrit Kal for our country. On the other hand, there are many global leaders who are suggesting that this could be India's decade, and some have gone a little beyond that and said this could be India's century. What are your views about these thoughts? What could be the impact of the world's troubles, various troubles that the world is facing, which you beautifully highlighted only a while ago? What could be the impact of those troubles on the India story? And given the troubles of the world, what kind of role can India play?
Yes, you are right. I think our Amrit Kal has just started. In fact, in this year's budget, the finance minister started the budget speech by saying this is the first budget of the Amrit Kal. And at the beginning of our discussion, Amit, we discussed about various challenges that the world is going through. World is lacking structural growth drivers, while we have a lot of structural growth drivers in place. Be it domestic consumption starting from a low base, highly underpenetrated across categories. We have opportunities in infrastructure over the next several years as we build the infrastructure for 21st century for 1.4 billion people. We have opportunities in offshoring and outsourcing. As I mentioned earlier, front office of the world, we have tremendous opportunities given the digitalization that we have seen in the country with ubiquitous internet, with smartphone penetration, and with the digital awareness, the digital knowledge that we have got. India produces more engineers than US and China combined. India produces more engineers than US and China combined. So tremendous opportunities even in becoming a front office of the world. So I think over the next several years, I keep using this sentence, but even at the cost of repetition, I would say we are creating an economic miracle which is unparalleled in human history. And why do I say that? It's not only about the growth that over the next several years or decades, we would be one of the fastest growing major economy in the world as we grow from $3 trillion of our size to 5, 7, 10, 15, $20 trillion. Our per capita GDP grows from $2,000 per capita to 4, 6, 8, 10,000. But it's not about the size of growth or the rate of growth. It's more about the quality of this growth, the model of this growth, which, as I said earlier, more sustainable, more equitable, more democratic, more inclusive. That makes India's Amrit Kaal very different from a lot of other economies which have gone through a high growth period over, let's say, a 20-25 year period. I think that's what the world will look up to India over the next several years, the kind of growth that has got generated, which is so different than most of the other countries that have grown like that. I'll just mention one point. It took over 100 years for women to get voting rights in the US. And it took even longer in several of the other developed countries of Europe to give voting right to women or voting right to several sections of the society. In India, we have a thriving democracy. From day one, we started with a universal franchise. And now, as I mentioned earlier, that as we are embarking on a high growth period, we are not saying that we won't care about the planet because our growth is going to be resource intensive and we have to take care of our people. Even at this stage, our Prime Minister on every global stage has committed that we'll be very responsible global citizen and we will ensure that our growth is more sustainable, more green and more good for the overall humanity. That makes India's Amrit Kaal very, very different, and I feel very positive and proud about it.
It's amazing the way you articulate these things. And as you said, even at the cost of repeating, I would love to repeat the same line. We are creating an economic miracle unparalleled in the history of the world. Wow. What a position to be in. And it actually makes you feel good to be born in a country at this particular time. The growth model that you talked about, the quality of growth that you talked about, not just the numbers or the rate, but an equitable growth, a sustainable growth, a democratic growth, and an inclusive growth. I think you summed it up beautifully well. But like in case of mutual funds, we always end up with risk factors and disclaimers. Let's come back to the India story also, and let's look at some of the potential risks to India growth story. What, according to you, are the potential threats or the potential risks to the beautiful picture that we just painted?
So while we feel very optimistic about a structural long-term growth story, but Amit, we have seen over the years there are ups and downs. While we can say that we are less dependent on global growth or we are less dependent on global flows relative to what we used to be in 2013 when there was a crisis in emerging markets, we were counted among the fragile five. Now over the last 2 or 3 years, clearly we have seen, thanks to the macro stability, thanks to the efforts done by our policymakers and the overall financial system, we are a lot more stable, whether whether it comes to financial stability, overall macro stability, and we are moving in the right direction. Having said that, there would be cycles. The world is going to face a slowdown. I mean, India cannot continue to grow at the highest possible rate. It will impact our growth as well. While in our career, we have always heard this line that if US sneezes or if rest of the world sneeze, India gets a fever. Now, as we discussed in the beginning of our talk, Amit, that world has got a fever. We are yet to sneeze, but we should not get complacent. I think if there are challenges outside India, in some manner they will impact us, whether through the trade channel or through the flows channel, through the overall sentiment, the global sentiment, they would impact us, though to the lesser extent. And of course, I think I just hope that we don't do any self-goal. I think taking an analogy from sports, several times we have seen that even a winning match is lost because one team or a player does a self-goal. I just hope that we don't do that self-goal. I feel very positive about India's story over the next several years, but I think we need to keep our eyes and ears open. We need to keep a very close eye on the global environment. Anything happens in the world, be it a recession in larger economies, that will impact us, and we need to fortify our macro. If, let's say, for any reason oil prices go up, for example, due to geopolitical risk or any other reason, we need to fortify ourselves against it. If flows slow down, if there is a tightening of global liquidity, we need to ensure that we are promoting domestic flows to counter that. So I think we need to keep our eyes and ears open to the global environment and ensure that we don't do a self-goal. Otherwise, yeah, India is moving in the right direction, and over the next several years, several decades, it could be our decade, it could be our century.
Navneet sir, as usual, as always, what an insightful discussion. You brought out some brilliant points about the troubles of the world, the place of India in this world, the opportunities ahead of us, and in the end you mentioned about let's not score a self-goal. It was pleasure talking to you, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Amit. My pleasure as well, and wish all the viewers very best.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.